Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible Backdrop Podcast. As promised, we're going to continue looking at the main religious and political sects during Jesus' time. For this episode, we're going to focus on the Zealots and the Essenes. Then we'll bring it all together by talking about their effect on Jesus' ministry. So let's start with the Zealots. They were founded around 6 AD by Judas the Galilean and Zadok the Pharisee. They had an extreme dedication to the Torah and believed that any collaboration with Rome was against God. For example, they tried to revolt against the census since it had been requested by a pagan emperor. They believed that the taxes should not be paid to a pagan government, and they favored direct confrontation with Rome and any Jew that collaborated with Rome. They despised tax collectors as they believed they were traitors to their people. They believed the Messiah would be an earthly leader to rid them of the Romans. They drew on Phinehas, son of Aaron, as their inspiration. His zeal for God is described in Numbers 25, 7 through 13. We hear different clues regarding zealots without any outright labels. Barabbas, who is freed instead of Jesus by Pontius Pilate, is believed to have been a zealot, as Luke describes him as having been imprisoned for, quote, insurrection and murder, end quote. It is also believed the two thieves being crucified with Jesus may have been zealots, as the words thief or robber were synonymous with zealot. Plus, you didn't get crucified for simple robbery. Romans used crucifixion as an example and warning to the population. Well, what happened to them? They were stamped out in 73 AD. After the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, just 960 zealots fled to the mountaintop fortress of Masada. They were able to hold out for 3 years before the Romans completed a new earthen siege weapon. When they finally breached the walls, they found everyone dead except for 2 women and 5 children. They decided it would be better to die than to live as Roman slaves. This brings us to the Essenes. We don't hear anything directly about the Essenes in the Bible. The only reason we know they existed is by finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are not only copied Old Testament texts, but also had some information about the Essene community. It appears that they were a 4th sect of Judaism that rejected the other 3. They felt the Sadducees had corrupted the temple and priesthood with their Hellenistic beliefs. The Pharisees tolerated too much since they continued to live under Roman rule, and the Zealots were too focused on fighting the Romans. The Essenes lived in monastic communities in the desert. The belief is that they lived celibate lives, shunned wealth, and had a strict lifestyle. They lived apart from the influence of the Romans and focused on studying and copying the Torah and other writings. Like most other groups, they disappeared after the Roman conquest in 70 AD. They're not mentioned directly in Scripture, but there are some that believe that the man carrying the water jug in Luke 22, 10 through 12 may have been an Essene, since only women carried water at that time. Also, there is some thought that John the Baptist may have been raised in an Essene community, as they were known to adopt children. As a child of older parents who may have died when he was very young, this is a plausible case. However, he would have had to have left the community in order to start his ministry. So, how did all these groups affect Jesus' ministry? Well, it seems that the Essenes really had very little impact. They shut themselves out from the world and didn't engage with many other people, which is why we don't hear anything about them. If John had been raised in an Essene community, then his preparing the way for Jesus would have been influenced by his learning there. The Zealots are an interesting bunch and may very well have affected the view of Jesus by the Roman officials at the time. First, we know that one of Jesus' 12 apostles was a zealot. I find it interesting that Jesus chose both a tax collector and a zealot to be among his closest companions. In 1st century Judea, you could not find 2 people further apart in their beliefs. You have to wonder how Simon the Zealot and Matthew got along in those early days. Jesus' ministry was probably watched closely by the Romans. Let's look at it from their perspective. The Romans know what it takes to win a war. There's a saying in the military: amateurs focus on tactics, professionals focus on logistics. It doesn't matter if you can outsmart your opponent if you don't have food, weapons, and medical supplies. Most of the countries Rome takes over don't have enough of these to fight back. How does this affect how they see Jesus? Well, what they see is a charismatic leader who can gather large crowds in a country where they are not welcome and hated by most of the people. And one of his closest friends is a zealot. And this leader can heal the sick, raise the dead, and make food appear out of nowhere. In their view, he could lead an army not only to take back Judea, but probably take over the known world. Now we understand why Rome was so concerned with Jesus' ministry. All of this may also be why Jesus moved away from crowds to minister to many different areas in Galilee and Judea. As a result of all this, Rome was probably happy to find a way to get rid of Jesus, as they almost certainly believed he was a zealot. What surprises me is that Pontius Pilate worked so hard to have him released. He must have heard everything that Jesus was doing and the fear from the local Roman officials. This brings us to the Pharisees. It seems that Jesus deals more with the Pharisees than the Sadducees, and this makes sense given that most of his ministry is around Galilee. If you recall from the last episode, the Pharisees were the common man scholars and could be found throughout the countryside. As a result, we see Jesus come into contact with the Pharisees again and again. When you enter Pharisee into BibleGateway.com, it comes back with 99 hits. In many of those verses, the Pharisees are upset about Jesus and his aversion to their understanding of the law of Moses and their traditions. Jesus pulls no punches, as he often calls them hypocrites for their zeal, but they forgot what the law represents. Jesus points this out in Matthew 23:23 when he says, quote, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." End quote. They follow the steps, and they believe this will bring righteousness, but they neglect mercy and compassion. Jesus uses them as a contrast to his teaching that focused on these things. They challenge Jesus often as he threatened their very core beliefs. As Jesus' ministry moves on, some Pharisees may have come to believe in him. Finally, we come to the Sadducees. As I said earlier, we don't see them as often since Jesus' ministry is focused on Galilee, with occasional trips into Judea and Jerusalem. As a result, he won't come into contact with them as much. In the last episode, I talked about the fact that their lives revolved around the temple, so they were centered in Jerusalem. Doing a search on Bible Gateway, it comes back with 15 hits, and 5 of those are from the book of Acts, after Jesus has ascended into heaven. So while we don't see them as often, they were definitely not happy with Jesus. The Sadducees owed their positions to the Romans, and they didn't want to upset the status quo, which Jesus was certainly doing. Jesus also goes directly against their teachings by talking about the resurrection and the destruction of the temple. When Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin before his death and resurrection, most of the people sitting in judgment were probably Sadducees. They, more than the Pharisees, were responsible for Jesus being crucified, as they had no qualms about using Roman punishments on their own people in order to keep their status and position in society. So, to review, the 4 sects of Judaism came out as a result of Greek and Roman rule. The Pharisees were everyman scholars and believed in the oral law along with the written law of Moses. They opposed Jesus because of his focus away from the law and onto more important things like justice and mercy. The Sadducees were aristocratic, believed only in the Torah, and identified with the high priesthood and the temple. They opposed Jesus because he challenged their beliefs and their status within Judaism. Both groups also had issues with Jesus saying that he is the Son of God. The Zealots may not have directly opposed Jesus' teaching, but they caused a lot of trouble by antagonizing the Romans through their method of direct confrontation and assassination. Their idea of the Messiah was one who would rescue them from Roman rule. Jesus, of course, was a very different Messiah who came to save the souls of people, not to lead a military uprising. I'm sure many Zealots were upset when Jesus told them to, quote, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." End quote. Finally, the Essenes do not really come into the story very much, but their influence may be found in their dedication to the Torah and Scriptures. They may also have had an influence on John the Baptist and his ministry, but that is up for debate. With that, this ends the mini-series on the main political groups during Jesus' ministry. I hope you enjoyed these past 2 episodes and will join me as we start looking at the Jewish feasts and how they relate to God's covenant. In the meantime, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe so that you immediately know when a new episode is released. Also, if you are enjoying Bible Backdrop, please leave a 5-star rating and review. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at biblebackdrop@gmail.com. Thanks, and have a great week.